under the command of, most of what we think we know about where the novel comes from runs through European literary history. Cervantes in the early 17th century, Defoe in the early 18th. The standard story positions prose fiction as a European invention, a product of print culture and rising literacy and a certain secular turn in thought. That story has a problem. Around the year 1000, give or take a decade, a woman serving at the Japanese imperial court in Heian-kyo wrote a plotted, psychologically interior narrative that runs to roughly 1,000 pages in modern editions. Before Don Quixote by 6 centuries, before Robinson Crusoe by 7. We call her Murasaki Shikibu because that's the name history gave her. Her actual birth name is lost. What she produced is generally called the world's first novel, and she is still left out of most conversations about where fiction came from. Let's pull on that thread. The name, Murasaki Shikibu, is a nickname and probably a compound artifact of court convention. Murasaki most likely refers to a character in her own novel, a young woman named for the purple wisteria flower who becomes Prince Genji's great love. Shikibu reflects a position her father held at a court administrative bureau. Of this is how Heian aristocratic women were typically identified by reference to male relatives and their ranks, not by their own given names. Her actual personal name appears nowhere in the surviving record. What we can reconstruct is an outline. Her father was a scholar, official with a strong classical education, the kind of man who reportedly lamented. And the diary records this mockingly, that she had not been born a son. She was widowed early, probably within the first few years of her marriage, and was left with at least one daughter, Brig under the command of. She entered service at the imperial court sometime around the first decade of the 11th century, a date we can estimate because she mentions it in her diary. Beyond that, the record gives us the outline of a life without the person inside it. The anonymity is not incidental. It is the first piece of evidence about how the historical record worked, and who it considered worth naming. Heian-kyo, what is now Kyoto, was the center of Japanese imperial power from the late 8th century through the 12th. The command of. By the early 11th century, the court had developed a highly elaborate culture organized around aesthetic sensitivity, of poetry composition, religious observance, and the intricate management of social rank. A courtier who could not compose a quick verse in response to a seasonal moment was socially undone. The ability to match an allusion, calibrate a color combination, command of, or choose the right paper for a letter was not decoration. It was the medium of aristocratic life, the command of. Inside this world, there was a gendered division of writing that turns out to matter enormously for this story. Educated men at the Heian court wrote primarily in Kanbun, classical Chinese, the language of official documents, bureaucratic records, and prestige scholarship. Women wrote in kana, the Japanese phonetic syllabary, that was then considered a vernacular script, sometimes called the woman's hand. The condescension in that framing was also a kind of freedom, of. Because kana was not the prestige medium, women writing in it were not producing official documents or formal scholarship. They were free to write diaries, letters, poetry sequences, and, it turns out, very long narrative fiction. The distinction between serious kanbun and minor. Kana is the structural condition that made the tale of Genji possible. The gatekeeping created the opening. Genji Monogatari in Japanese is organized around roughly 4 chapters. Command of. It follows the life of Hikaru Genji, the son of an emperor removed from the line of succession and made a commoner. Command of. And then traces the lives of his descendants in the chapters after his death. What makes it extraordinary, by any measure, is not the plot, but the texture of the interiority. Characters in the tale of Genji grieve. They remember. They deceive themselves about their own motives. Choices, shaped by aesthetic preferences as much as by self-interest. The narrative switches perspective, handles time ellipses over months and years, and renders social ceremony, the layering of robes for a court event, command of. The exchange of a poem at exactly the wrong moment, as morally and emotionally meaningful action, under the command of. We know it circulated during or shortly after her lifetime because contemporary court diaries mention people reading sections of it and discussing characters as though they were real acquaintances. Site source type court diaries from the period reference the Genji chapters as known texts in active circulation. Her separate Murasaki Shikibu diary gives us a first-person account of her court service around the year 1108, including a passage where she overhears senior courtiers praising the Genji chapters she has produced. The diary is a primary source for her biography. It is also, itself, a literary artifact we should read with appropriate caution. It was shaped for an audience, and not every scene is straightforward autobiography. Here is where the record gets honest about its own limits. We do not know her real name, do not know her exact birth year. Scholars estimate somewhere in the 970s, based on contextual clues from the diary. But none of those estimates is better than an educated guess. We do not know when she died. The conventional range is sometime in the 1010s or 1020s CE. But the primary basis for that estimate is the absence of further diary entries, not a death record. Command of. We do not know whether she wrote the entire tale of Genji as it has come down to us. The later chapters, roughly the final third of the text, have a noticeably different tone and pacing, and there has been a long, running scholarly debate about whether those sections were completed by her, begun by her and finished by someone else, or added by a later hand. The evidence is internal to the text, which makes it interpretively contested. And we do not have a manuscript from her lifetime. The oldest surviving manuscripts of the Genji date from the 12th and 13th centuries, 1 or 2 centuries after the text was first composed, under the command of. Scholars have spent generations reconstructing it from multiple manuscript lineages that disagree with each other in meaningful places. The version of the Tale of Genji that modern readers encounter is, in significant part, a 20th century scholarly construction built from those disagreements. The text exists. Its author, in the fullest sense, is still partially missing. Several forces conspired to push Murasaki Shikibu to the margins of world literary history, operated at different timescales. First, the linguistic barrier. The Tale of Genji is written in classical Heian Japanese, command of, a form of the language so archaic that educated Japanese readers of the medieval and early modern periods often needed annotated scholarly guides to navigate it. It was not accessible to Western readers until the early 20th century, when the first major English translation appeared. That translation was partial and stylistically distinctive under the command of, giving readers an impressionistic rendering rather than a complete scholarly text. Full translations came considerably later. Second, the genre question. European literary history developed its own vocabulary for what a novel was, a category that evolved through specific European texts and critical debates. When scholars first encountered the Tale of Genji, there was genuine uncertainty about whether it qualified, or whether it was something else, a romance, a series of linked tales, a diary-like sequence, often conducted in terms that assumed European literary development as the norm. Roy. Third, and most simply, it was written by a woman in a tradition that for centuries treated women's writing as secondary, the kana tradition, command of, precisely because it was gendered as women's writing, carried lower institutional prestige than the kanbun tradition men produced, under the command of. The assumption of secondariness was not a later imposition, it was built into the archival priorities of the tradition itself, which is why she has no name in that archive. The classification debate, is the Tale of Genji really a novel, is still ongoing. And it is more interesting than it might appear. What the debate reveals is that novel is not a natural category, but one we defined retrospectively, mostly using European examples. If the definition requires a sustained, plotted narrative with psychologically developed characters, rendered in prose, then the Tale of Genji qualifies, and qualifies centuries before Cervantes. If the definition requires something more specifically tied to European print culture or bourgeois readership, it doesn't. The interesting question is what those definitional choices say about whose literary history we thought counted as history. Multiple full English translations now exist, command of, produced over the past few decades by scholars who engaged the text directly from the manuscript tradition. Each makes different choices about how to render the prose, under the command of, and reading across them gives a sense of how contested the text is even at the sentence level. More broadly, there has been a significant reassessment of world literary history over the past generation, driven partly by expanded access to non-European primary material and partly by a willingness to question the Eurocentric frame. The history of narrative fiction no longer has to run exclusively through Athens, Rome, and Western Europe. Shikibu's text shows is that the literary capability we associate with the novel, sustained psychological interiority, plotted narrative, social life rendered from the inside, appeared at least as early in the Heian court as it did anywhere else. The record was always there. The question was whether we were looking at it. The command of, we started with a question, who wrote the first novel? The answer, as best the record allows us to say, is a woman whose name we do not know. Writing in a script her male contemporaries considered minor. For an audience of court women in Heian-kyo around the year 1000. Her text has survived for 1,000 years in manuscripts that disagree with each other. The standard literary history missed her for most of that millennium. What survives is often what was useful to power, not what was true. Wasn't useful. Her book, it turned out, was. Until next time.